The morning sky over Larkspur Hall was the color of a bruise, grey fading into gold at the edges, and the field below it smelled of crushed grass and horse sweat and fear. Hundreds of guests stood along the white roped course in silken wool, gloves pressed to their mouths, whispering the same cruel sentence in different words. There she goes again, the breeder's daughter, playing Duchess. Rena Ashgrove did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the paddock at the far end of the field, where a black warhorse named Reins stood alone behind a fence no groom dared cross. His coat was the color of wet coal. A long white scar ran from his shoulder to his ribs, a memory of a war he had survived and a man he had not brought home. Rena's heart beat so loudly she could feel it in her throat. She had trained for this moment in secret for months, at dawn when the house was asleep and no one could stop her. Now the house was awake and everyone was watching. She lifted the latch on the paddock gate with 2 fingers, slow and quiet, the way her father had taught her years ago in a stable that no longer existed. The hinge groaned. Thrain's ears snapped toward the sound, then toward her, and for one breath the whole world seemed to hold still, waiting to see what the horse would do. A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Lady Delphine Crane raised a gloved hand to her smiling mouth, already savoring what she believed was coming. Old Corwin, the stable master, gripped the fence rail until his knuckles whitened, his lips moving in a silent prayer he had not used since the war took the old duke's younger son. Rena stepped inside the paddock anyway. The gate clicked shut behind her, and there was no more pretending this could be undone. 8 months ago, she had been a stranger in this house, a name spoken in the same breath as scandal and pity. She had learned to walk through Larkspur Hall the way one walks through a room full of sleeping dogs, careful, quiet, never quite trusting the floor beneath her feet to hold. Today she was not walking carefully. She could feel the wind lifting the loose strands of hair at her temple, smell the bruised grass and the leather of her own gloves, taste the copper edge of fear at the back of her throat. Somewhere to her left, a baron's wife whispered loudly enough to be heard, wondering aloud whether the duke would forgive his wife for the embarrassment before or after the funeral. Rena did not flinch. She had buried a father with far less ceremony than this crowd would ever offer a horse, and she had learned that survival rarely waited for anyone's permission. The closer she came, the larger Thrain seemed, his shoulder alone taller than her head, his breath rolling out in great white clouds against the cold morning air. She could see the old scar clearly now, pale and ridged beneath the black coat, and beneath it, the faint tremor running through his frame that had nothing to do with cold. Fear. The same fear she had carried in her own chest every night since the fire took her father's stables, dressed in a different body, wearing a different scar. She understood, in that instant, exactly why no soldier, no groom, and no duke had ever managed to win this animal's trust. They had all tried to conquer him. She had only ever tried to sit quietly beside his grief and wait. "Rena, stop!" Roan's voice cracked across the field like a whip, raw with something that was not anger at all, though it sounded like anger to everyone who heard it. He had vaulted the rope line before he even knew he was moving, his polished boots tearing into the grass, his face drained of every color a duke was supposed to keep in public. "You cannot control that warhorse!" The words tore out of him, louder than he meant, loud enough to silence the band that had been playing a cheerful tune for the opening of the contest. Every head on that field turned toward the paddock at once. 300 pairs of eyes, one terrified husband, one horse that had thrown 4 trained soldiers and broken a stable boy's arm the previous spring, and one woman who had been told her entire life that she did not belong anywhere near greatness. Rena did not answer him. She had learned, in 3 long months of marriage to a man who barely looked at her, that answering only gave people more reasons to argue with you. Instead, she walked forward, slow and even, the way she would approach a frightened child, her palm open and low, her shawl slipping from one shoulder and catching on the spring wind. Thrain's nostrils flared, his great head swung up, eyes rolling white at the edges, hooves shifting backward over churned earth. Somewhere behind her she heard Iris, 16 years old, and the only person in that family who had ever truly smiled at her, whisper her name like a prayer. Somewhere behind her she heard the Dowager Duchess say nothing at all, which was somehow louder than every gasp in the crowd combined. Rena kept walking. She had nothing left to lose that she had not already lost once before. "Easy," she said, so softly that only the horse could have heard it. "I know what they took from you. I know exactly what that feels like." Thrain's ears flicked toward her voice, uncertain. The way a man might lean toward warmth he no longer trusted was real. His muscles bunched beneath that ruined black coat, every line of him coiled to bolt or to rear, and Rena understood with absolute clarity that in the next 3 seconds she would either save everything she had quietly built, or she would be carried off that field in pieces in front of the only family she had left. She reached out and closed her fingers around the leather rein hanging loose at his throat. Thrain screamed, a sound like splitting timber, and rose onto his hind legs with the full terrible height of a creature built for war, his front hooves cutting the air directly above her skull. The crowd's gasp became a single collective sound, a held breath turned into a shriek that froze every spectator where they stood. Lady Delphine's triumphant smile cracked into something closer to horror. Iris screamed Rena's name and was caught by Corwin's arm before she could climb the fence herself. And Roan, who had buried a brother and built a fortress around his heart so that loss could never again walk through the front door, stood frozen at the rope line with his hand outstretched toward a wife he had married out of guilt, and was only now, in the worst possible second, beginning to understand he could not survive losing. Rena did not let go of the rein. Above her, 2,000 pounds of grief and muscle hung suspended in the grey morning light, and the entire future of Larkspur Hall came down to whether her grip would hold. Time did the strange thing it does only in the worst moments of a life, stretching 1 second into something that felt like minutes. Rena saw the underside of Thrain's hooves catch the grey light. She saw Rowan's face, stripped of every careful, dukish mask he had worn for 2 years. Nothing left on it but raw, naked fear for her. She saw, at the very edge of her vision, the Dowager Duchess rise halfway from her seat with one gloved hand pressed flat against her own chest. She heard Iris sobbing her name. She heard nothing from Delphine at all, which she would only understand the meaning of much later. None of it mattered in that frozen instant except the leather biting into her palms and the choice she had already made the moment she lifted that latch. Whatever happened next, she was not going to let go. 6 months earlier, Rena Calloway had buried the last of her family in a churchyard so small the gravedigger worked alone. Her father, Elias Calloway, had once bred the finest cavalry horses in 3 counties, his name spoken with respect from London auction yards to the muddy paddocks of Yorkshire. Then a fire took half his stables in one black night, and a bad harvest took the rest the following spring, and the debts came due all at once like wolves that had been circling for years. Rena had nursed him through his final winter alone, selling her mother's wedding ring to pay for coal, learning that pride was a luxury only the comfortable could afford. When the letter arrived from Larkspur Hall, sealed in heavy wax with a crest she did not recognize, she almost did not open it. She had nothing left worth a duke's attention. She was wrong. She remembered the exact weight of that letter in her hand, how the wax cracked under her thumbnail with a sound like a small bone breaking, how the fire in the grate had already burned down to its last red coal because she had been rationing wood since October. The house around her had been stripped of nearly everything sellable, curtains gone, silver gone, even the good chairs sold to a dealer from Leeds who had not met her eyes once during the whole transaction. She had nothing left to lose, which was its own strange kind of freedom, and she read the Duke of Larkspur's words by the dying firelight with the flat, exhausted calm of someone who had stopped expecting good news from any envelope, ever again. The letter was from Rowan Ashgrove himself, written in a hand so controlled it betrayed nothing of what writing it had cost him. His late father, the old Duke, had borrowed heavily from Elias Calloway years before to fund an ambitious breeding program meant to restore the Ashgrove cavalry stock after a war that had cost the family more than money. The old Duke had died before the debt was settled, and Rowan had discovered the truth only after his father's papers were finally opened, that the Calloway family's ruin had been hastened, in part, by an Ashgrove promise that was never kept. He could have sent money quietly and let shame do the rest. Instead, he offered marriage, his title, and the protection of his name, framed not as charity, but as a debt of honor finally paid. Rena read the letter 3 times in a cold kitchen with nothing left to burn, and on the 4th reading, she understood it was not a rescue. It was a transaction wearing the clothes of kindness. She accepted anyway. There was no version of pride that fed a person through another Yorkshire winter, and her father had taught her that survival was its own kind of dignity. She arrived at Larkspur Hall in a borrowed travelling dress, her trunk containing exactly one good gown and a small wooden box of her father's breeding journals, the only inheritance no fire had managed to destroy. The house rose out of the moorland like something carved rather than built, grey stone softened by ivy, 400 years of Ashgrove pride pressed into every window. A footman took her trunk without meeting her eyes. The Dowager Duchess, Augusta Ashgrove, received her in a drawing room so cold it might have had its own weather, looked her up and down once, and said only, "So you are the price my husband's carelessness has cost this family." It was not a welcome, it was a verdict. Roan himself did not appear until dinner, and when he did, Rena understood immediately why the servants moved around him the way people move around a sleeping wolf. He was tall, dark-haired, handsome in the exhausted way of a man who had not slept properly in years, and he looked at her across the long table with an expression of careful, distant courtesy that never once reached his eyes. "Mrs. Ashgrove," he said, testing the name like a man checking ice before he stepped onto it. He did not call her Duchess. He would not, she later realized, call her that for months, as though the title itself was something he was not yet willing to give her. Their wedding had happened 3 days after her arrival, in a small chapel with no flowers, attended by exactly 4 people, none of whom looked happy. She had signed her new name with a steady hand and felt nothing break inside her, because there had been nothing left whole enough to break. What she had not expected in those first cold weeks was Iris. The Duke's younger sister found her, on her second morning, wandering the East Gardens alone, and simply fell into step beside her as though they had always walked together. "You don't talk much," Iris said, 16 and fearless in the way only the youngest child of a grieving house can be. "Neither does Roan anymore. He used to, before Edmund." Rena asked who Edmund was, and Iris's bright face folded into something older than her years. "Our brother," she said. "He died 2 years ago. Nobody talks about it. Nobody's allowed to." She nodded toward a paddock at the edge of the gardens, fenced off from the rest of the estate by rails twice as tall as any other on the property. Behind them stood a black horse, alone, watching them with an unblinking, wounded stillness. "That was his horse," Iris said quietly. "No one's touched him since. Roan won't let them." Rena stood at that fence longer than she meant to. The horse did not approach her, but he did not retreat either, which she would later understand was rarer than it sounded. There was something in the animal's rigid stillness that she recognized instantly, a grief held so tightly it had calcified into something that looked like rage from the outside. She had seen that same stillness in her own reflection every morning since her father's funeral. She did not know yet that this horse would become the bridge between her loneliness and a husband who had built his entire heart into a locked room. She only knew, standing in the cold spring air with her shawl pulled tight against the wind, that she had never in her life wanted so badly to be let in. "He used to be different," Iris said quietly, watching the horse with her too. "When Edmund brought him home, he'd let stable boys ride him bareback for a penny a turn. He used to nuzzle apples right out of my hand." She wrapped her arms around herself against the wind. "I keep waiting for someone to fix him. I think everyone's forgotten that horses can be fixed, the way they've forgotten that people can too." She glanced sideways at Rena with a directness that startled her. "You have sad eyes, you know. The same kind he has. Maybe that's why he didn't run from you." It was the first true thing anyone at Larkspur Hall had said to her since her arrival, and Rena found she had no answer for it at all, only a tightness in her throat that she pressed down and carried back to the house with her, unspoken, the way she carried everything. The first month at Larkspur Hall taught Rena exactly what was expected of her, and it was very little. She was to sit beautifully at dinner. She was to say nothing that might embarrass the family name she now carried like borrowed jewelry. She was to attend the Dowager Duchess on her morning calls and smile at women who measured her hands for calluses and her vowels for cracks. She did all of it perfectly, because perfection was the only armor she had left. And underneath the silk and the practiced curtsies, she felt herself disappearing one polite sentence at a time. Roan was kind to her in the careful, distant way one might be kind to a guest who had not chosen to stay. He asked after her comfort. He never asked after her. There was a difference, and Rena felt it every single day, like a stone in her shoe she was too proud to remove in front of anyone. At a dinner for the local magistrate and his wife, Rena sat through an hour of careful conversation about crops and weather before the magistrate's wife turned to her with the particular brightness of someone about to say something unkind while believing it sounded like curiosity. "Tell me, Duchess, is it true you once mucked out stalls yourself? One does hear such extraordinary things." The table went quiet in the particular way Larkspur's dinners always went quiet when Rena was the subject. She set down her fork with deliberate calm. "I did," she said. "My father believed a person should never ask an animal to do something they were unwilling to do themselves. I have found the same principle works rather well with people." Roan, at the head of the table, did not laugh, but something flickered briefly at the corner of his mouth before he smoothed it away, and Rena decided that small, private, almost smile was worth more to her than the magistrate's wife's good opinion would ever be. The visit from Lady Delphine Crane arrived like weather no one had forecast. She swept into the morning room in lavender silk, golden curls arranged with the precision of a woman who had once expected to be standing in that exact room as its mistress, and she greeted Rena with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "The Duchess of Larkspur," she said, drawing the title out as though it tasted strange in her mouth. How extraordinary that a man of Rowan's standing should marry so far beneath his prospects. "Tell me, did your father truly sell horses for a living?" The Dowager Duchess said nothing to defend her, only sipped her tea with the careful blankness of a woman keeping score of every insult for later use. Rena kept her spine straight and her hands still in her lap. "He bred the finest cavalry horses in 3 counties, she said evenly. "I imagine that is closer to the family business than most of the titles in this room ever earned honestly." Delphine's smile thinned. Iris, hidden behind a book in the corner, grinned at the carpet. It was the carriage horses that changed something, though no one important was watching when it happened. Rena had gone walking near the stable yard one grey afternoon, restless inside her own silence, when a delivery cart's horse spooked at a dropped crate of glass bottles and reared between the shafts hard enough to splinter the harness pole. Grooms shouted. The cart driver yanked the reins the wrong way, panicking the animal further, and for a moment it seemed certain the horse would bolt straight into the kitchen garden wall. Rena did not think. She moved toward the horse's head instead of away from it, caught the cheek strap with both hands, and began speaking in the low, steady voice her father had used on every frightened animal she had ever watched him gentle. The horse stilled within seconds, sides heaving, ears finally swiveling toward her instead of toward the noise. The stable yard went quiet, with a different kind of shock entirely. Old Corwin had watched the whole thing from the tack-room door, and he said nothing about it to anyone that day, but he began, from that afternoon forward, to nod at her when she passed the stables, a small thing that meant everything in a house where almost no one acknowledged her at all. Roan heard the story second-hand, weeks later, from a footman who mentioned it in passing as though it were a curiosity rather than a revelation. "My wife handled a runaway cart horse," he repeated slowly, testing the sentence the way he tested everything. He found her that evening in the library and studied her with an expression she could not read. "You might have been killed," he said, and it was almost an accusation. "I was raised around horses, Your Grace," she answered. "I know what fear looks like before it becomes danger. It is usually the same thing that frightens people." He looked at her a moment longer, as though seeing some unfamiliar shape behind a curtain he had not realized was there, and then he simply said goodnight and left the room, and Rena understood that being seen by him, even briefly, hurt more than being invisible ever had. That night, unable to sleep, she walked the east gardens alone and found herself once again at the tall fence where Thrain stood watching the dark. She did not try to approach him. She only sat on the cold grass a respectful distance away, knees drawn to her chest, and talked quietly into the night about her father, about fire and debt, and a life that had vanished in a single winter. The horse did not move toward her, but his ears, she noticed, stayed turned in her direction the entire time, the way a person listens to a story they are not yet ready to admit they want to hear. It became a habit she told no one about. Some nights she only sat in silence. Some nights she spoke. Every night, Thrain stayed close enough to listen, and slowly, without either of them choosing it, 2 grieving creatures began keeping each other company in the dark. She started bringing small things with her, not as bribes but as offerings, a heel of bread saved from supper, a sprig of mint pulled from the kitchen garden wall. She never tried to feed him by hand in those early weeks. She simply set the offering on the top rail and walked away. And in the morning it was always gone, even on the nights he had not come within 20 feet of her. It was a conversation conducted almost entirely in silence and patience, the same language her father had spoken to every wounded, frightened, broken-down animal he had ever brought back from the edge of being beyond saving. She began to understand, sitting in the cold grass night after night with her breath fogging in front of her, that she had not come to Larkspur Hall merely to be rescued. She had come, without anyone intending it, to do some rescuing of her own. It was Corwin who finally told her the truth, on a rain-soaked afternoon when the stable smelled of wet straw and oiled leather, and Rena had asked the question she had been circling for weeks. What happened to him? She meant the horse. Corwin understood she meant the man as well. He set down the bridle he had been mending and looked at her for a long moment, deciding something. Master Edmund was the Duke's younger brother, he said at last. Brighter than Roan in company, quicker to laugh, the kind of young man rooms turned toward without trying. He joined the cavalry against his father's wishes, came home from the wars with that horse and more medals than sense, and for 2 years he was the only thing that made this house feel like it had any joy left in it at all. He paused, jaw working. Then there was an argument between the brothers, the worst kind, the kind that happens between people who love each other too much to be careful with the words. Rena asked what the argument had been about, and Corwin shook his head slowly. Roan wanted him to give up that horse. Said the animal had seen too much of war to ever be safe in peacetime, said it for Edmund's own good. Edmund said his brother understood duty and nothing else, and he rode out that same night in temper, in a storm that any sensible man would have waited out by the fire. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the stable roof like a held breath, finally released. Thrain came back without him by morning. Master Edmund was found at the bottom of Cray's Gorge 2 days later. They said the horse spooked on the cliff path in the dark and threw him. Corwin's voice dropped lower. Roan never forgave that horse. And from what the staff whisper, he never forgave himself either, for the last thing his brother ever heard from him being an order instead of love. Corwin set down the bridle entirely now, his weathered hands still in his lap, and looked toward the rain-streaked window as though he could still see that night reflected in the glass. I was the one who found Thrain at first light, he said. Standing at the stable gate, lathered white, reins torn loose, a wound across his shoulder where he must have scraped the cliff rock on the way down trying to save himself. I have wondered every day since whether he tried to save Master Edmund too, and simply couldn't. A horse can't tell you these things. He can only show you, and what he showed all of us was 2 years of standing very still and trusting no one, which I have always thought was the truest grief I ever saw an animal carry. He looked at Rena directly then. You asked me what happened to him, Your Grace. I think the truer question is what happened to all of them, the night that horse came home alone. Rena sat very still, the weight of it settling into her chest like cold water, finding the lowest point in a room. That was why the fence was twice as tall as any other on the estate. That was why no groom was permitted near the paddock, why Roan paid for Thrain's feed and care from his own pocket and never once visited him. The horse was not being punished. He was being preserved, the way a man preserves the last unread letter from someone he can no longer ask forgiveness from. Keeping Thrain alive and untouched was Roan's only remaining way of keeping Edmund close, and keeping him locked away from everyone, including himself, was the only way he knew how to survive the guilt of it. Rena thought of her own father's journals, sitting untouched in their wooden box upstairs, because she had not yet found the courage to read his handwriting again. Grief, she realized, built very similar prisons no matter whose hands constructed them. She began visiting Thrain at first light after that, before the house woke, wrapped in an old wool cloak with sugar lumps stolen from the breakfast tray pressed into her palm. She did not rush him. Her father had taught her that trust was never won by force, only by the simple, repeated proof that you would keep showing up and asking for nothing. The first week, Thrain would not come within 10 feet of the fence. The second week, he stood closer, ears forward instead of pinned. By the third week, he allowed her hand near his nose for the space of 3 full breaths before retreating, and Rena found herself laughing alone in the dawn fog for the first time since her father's funeral, a sound so unfamiliar it startled her own ears. The mornings developed their own quiet ritual, one she came to treasure more than any of the polished, scripted hours she spent inside the house. She would arrive before the birds fully woke, set her shawl over the lowest fence rail, and simply sit in the wet grass describing whatever small thing had happened the day before. A torn hem, a kind word from Iris, the particular shade of orange the sky had turned at sunset. Thrain never answered, of course, but his ears would track her voice the entire time, and on the mornings the fog was thickest, she sometimes imagined Edmund listening too, somewhere just past the edge of what she could see, glad that something of his was finally being looked after the way he would have wanted. She told no one. Not Iris, who would have been thrilled and therefore careless with the secret. Not the Dowager Duchess, who would have called it improper. And certainly not Roan, who she understood now carried a wound so deep that the wrong touch could tear it open entirely rather than heal it. She did not yet know why she kept returning to that fence each morning, only that something in her recognized something in the horse. Two creatures who had lost the people who anchored them and had been told in different ways that the safest thing left to do was stop trusting anything that might leave again. Each morning the distance between them shrank by inches. Each morning, walking back to the house before the staff stirred, Rena felt something in her own chest loosen by exactly the same amount, as though healing him and healing herself had quietly, without permission, become the very same work. She found, in the wooden box of her father's journals that winter, a single line written in his careful hand that she had read 100 times without understanding it until now. A frightened animal does not need a master. It needs a witness. She copied the line onto a scrap of paper and kept it folded in her sleeve, taking it out sometimes in the grey hour before dawn, while she waited at the paddock fence for Thrain to decide, once again, whether that morning was the morning he would finally let her close her. She had spent her whole life being told what a woman was permitted to want, what a duchess was permitted to do, what a breeder's daughter had no right to attempt. Standing in that cold field with sugar lumps melting against her palm, she began, for the first time since the fire took everything, to suspect that she might be permitted more than anyone at Larkspur Hall had yet imagined. By midsummer, Larkspur Hall had begun to feel less like a museum, and more, occasionally, like a home, though Rena could not have said precisely when the shift began. Iris had taken to seeking her out for everything from torn hems to broken hearts over a stable boy who barely knew she existed, treating Rena less like a duchess and more like the older sister she had never had. Even the Dowager Duchess had softened by degrees too small to name, asking once, almost accidentally, whether Rena's mother had also kept bees, and listening to the answer longer than courtesy required. And then there was little Toby, the 6-year-old son of a distant cousin sent to Larkspur for the summer while his own parents settled abroad, who attached himself to Rena within a week with the fierce, uncomplicated loyalty only small children offer freely. He followed her through the gardens, asking endless questions about horses, and she answered every one of them, because no one had ever bothered to ask her the same questions back. Toby arrived at Larkspur thin and watchful, the kind of quiet that worried nursemaids more than tears would have, and it was Rena who first coaxed a real laugh out of him 3 days after his arrival by letting him feed a carrot to one of the gentler carriage horses and narrating the horse's opinion of the carrot in an absurd, gravelly voice until the boy was breathless with giggling in the stable yard. "Will you teach me to talk to horses too?" he asked her solemnly that evening, as though it were the most important question anyone had ever asked her, and in a way, for him, it was. "Only if you promise to be patient," Rena told him. "Horses can tell the difference between someone who is patient and someone who is only pretending to be." Toby had nodded with the gravity of a much older man sealing a contract, and from that day forward he trailed her everywhere, a small shadow with sticky hands and an endless supply of questions, filling a quiet corner of her heart she had not realized was still empty. Roan noticed these things from a careful distance, the way a man watches weather change through a window he has decided not to open. He noticed Rena laughing with his sister over something in a letter. He noticed his mother asking her opinion on the autumn menu and actually waiting for the answer. He noticed Toby falling asleep against her shoulder in the drawing room one evening, and something in his chest had pulled tight and strange, an ache he did not have a name for because he had spent 2 years refusing to name any ache at all. One evening, caught in a sudden storm while riding home from the tenant farms, He found Rena already soaked through in the stable yard, calmly walking his own anxious gelding in slow circles to settle him before the thunder could do real damage. "You didn't need to do that," he said, water running down his collar. "No," she agreed, not stopping her steady circling. "I wanted to." It was such a small thing. It cost him more sleep than he expected. Lady Delphine Crane returned to Larkspur in late summer with an invitation no one quite remembered extending, and she arrived with sharper purpose than her last visit. She found the Dowager Duchess alone in the rose garden and settled beside her with the practiced ease of an old friend laying careful groundwork. "I only worry for the family name," Delphine said, voice syrup-sweet over something far colder beneath it. "A breeder's daughter, raised among stable hands, suddenly mistress of Larkspur. People do talk, Your Grace. They say she married Roan for the title and nothing more, that she's clever enough to play the dutiful wife until she's secured her position. And then we shall see her true colors." The Dowager Duchess said nothing, but something in her face which had been slowly, privately reconsidering everything she had decided about Rena in one cold first meeting, closed again like a door catching a draft. Doubt, once planted, did not need much water to grow. Delphine pressed further, sensing the opening. "I have known the Ashgrove family since I was a girl," she said softly, folding her gloved hands in her lap with the air of a woman performing reluctant honesty. "I would never wish to see this household embarrassed by someone who does not understand how things are done among people of consequence. Surely you have wondered, even once, why a woman with nothing left to her name would accept a marriage offered out of guilt rather than affection." The Dowager Duchess turned to look at her then, something unreadable crossing her face, and said only, "I have wondered a great many things about a great many people, Lady Delphine, including why you have visited this house twice in 3 months when you managed not to visit it once in the 2 years before my son married." It was not quite a dismissal, but it was enough to send a small flicker of alarm across Delphine's composed features, quickly smoothed away before it could be noticed. Rena felt the change before she understood its source, a coolness returning to the Dowager Duchess's manner that had not been there the week before, certain questions about her background asked with a different, sharper edge at dinner. She did not yet know about Delphine's visit, only that ground she believed she had quietly earned seemed to be shifting again beneath her feet, the way it always had her entire life, just when she dared to believe she might finally be allowed to stay somewhere. She kept visiting Thrain anyway, because that, at least, was hers, a private place no rumor had found yet. By midsummer, the horse would press his great head against her shoulder and stand utterly still while she worked the tangles from his mane with her fingers, a level of trust Corwin swore he had never witnessed in 2 years of trying. "He let no one near him," Corwin told her quietly one dawn, watching from the fence with something close to wonder. "Not me. Not the Duke. You he chose." She mentioned the coolness to Iris over breakfast one morning, careful to keep her voice light, and Iris's face darkened immediately. "Lady Delphine was here last week," she admitted, stirring her tea harder than necessary. "She and Grandmother sat in the rose garden for nearly an hour. I didn't hear what was said, but Grandmother hasn't been the same since." Iris reached across the table and squeezed Rena's hand with sudden fierce loyalty. "Don't let her win whatever she's trying to do. You belong here more than she ever could, and everyone in this house knows it except the people too stubborn to say so out loud." Rena managed a smile she did not entirely feel, grateful for the girl's certainty even as her own began, once again to fray quietly at the edges, the way it always did whenever she let herself believe, even briefly, that a place might finally be hers to keep. What Rena could not have predicted was that her growing closeness with Thrain, the one secret joy she had allowed herself in a house built on careful distances, would soon become the very thing that nearly destroyed everything she had spent 6 months quietly building. She didn't yet know that Roan would discover her secret before she ever found the courage to share it herself. She did not know that the discovery would arrive not gently, in his own time, but violently, in a moment of fear mistaken for fury, tearing open a wound in him that had been waiting 2 long years for exactly this kind of pressure to finally split apart. Roan found her at dawn, 3 days after Delphine's second visit, and the discovery happened by the cruelest possible accident. He had risen before sunrise, restless with a tension he could not name, and walked toward the stables intending nothing more than fresh air. Instead, he saw his wife inside Edmund's paddock. The gate he had nailed shut himself 2 winters ago, somehow standing open, her bare hand resting against the warhorse's scarred neck, while the animal stood motionless beside her, like a creature carved from black stone. For one suspended second, Roan's mind refused to assemble what his eyes were showing him. Then fear arrived all at once, ugly and absolute, and fear in Roan Ashgrove had only ever worn one disguise his entire adult life. "Get away from him," he said, and his voice cracked across the quiet morning like breaking ice. "Get away from him now." He had not slept well in days, his mind circling Delphine's visit and the strange new coolness it had stirred in his mother, and seeing his wife standing inside the one place at Larkspur he had sealed off from the entire world felt, in that disoriented half-waking moment, like watching someone walk calmly into a fire he had spent 2 years building a wall around, specifically to keep everyone else safe from it. He told himself, even as he crossed the yard, that his fury was about the horse and nothing else, that any reasonable husband would react exactly this way to discovering an unpredictable animal standing inches from his wife's unguarded throat. He did not yet have the language to admit that what truly terrified him was far simpler and far more dangerous than any horse could ever be. The realization, arriving far too late and far too suddenly, of exactly how much he stood to lose. Thrain startled at the sound, ears pinning flat, and for one terrible heartbeat, Rena thought the horse might bolt straight through her. He did not. He simply stepped half a pace closer to her instead, as though her body were somehow the safer place to stand, and that single small motion seemed to undo something in Roan entirely. He crossed the yard in long, furious strides, hauled the gate open, and pulled her bodily out of the paddock with a grip far rougher than he had ever used with her before. "Do you have any idea what that animal has done?" he demanded, hands shaking, color drained from his face in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with terror he did not have language for. "Do you know how many men he has thrown? He killed my—" He stopped himself, jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out, unable to finish the sentence he had never once finished aloud in 2 years. "He didn't kill Edmund," Rena said quietly, and the name landed in the wet morning air like a stone dropped into still water. Roan went rigid. "The cliff path killed Edmund. The storm killed Edmund. Maybe the argument that sent him riding off in the dark in a temper killed Edmund. But not this horse, who has spent 2 years standing alone behind a fence twice as tall as any other on this estate, grieving exactly the same man you refused to let yourself grieve." The words hung between them, sharper than she had intended, true enough to cut through everything he had spent 2 years carefully not saying. "You don't know anything about it," Roan said, voice low and dangerous, but his hands were trembling and his eyes had gone bright and wet in a way that betrayed every word he was trying to use as armor. "I know loss," Rena answered, steady despite the ache rising in her own throat. "I know exactly what it costs to lock a door and call it strength instead of fear." "You think this is the same?" he said, his voice climbing despite himself, rain beginning to fall harder around them both, soaking through his shirt and her cloak alike. "You think burying a father is the same as watching your own brother ride to his death because of words you chose in anger and can never take back?" "No," Rena said, refusing to step away from him, even as the rain ran cold down the back of her neck. "I think grief doesn't keep score of which version of it hurts worse. I think you have spent 2 years punishing yourself through that horse and calling it grief, when really it is guilt, and guilt is a much crueler animal to keep locked in a paddock than the one standing behind that fence." Roan flinched as though she had struck him, and for one raw, unguarded second, she saw the boy he must have been before the title, before the duty, before 2 funerals taught him that love was simply something fate eventually came to collect. Something in his face broke open then, just for a moment, raw and unguarded in a way she had never once been permitted to see, and then he closed it again with visible, painful effort, like a man slamming a door on his own hand to keep something worse from getting through it. "Stay away from that horse," he said, quieter now, which was somehow worse than the shouting. "I am asking you, stay away from him." He turned and walked back toward the house without waiting for her answer, his shoulders set in the rigid line she had learned in 6 months of marriage meant the conversation was over whether she agreed to end it or not. Rena stood alone in the wet grass long after he disappeared, Thrain pressing his nose gently against her shoulder from over the fence rail, and for the first time since arriving at Larkspur Hall, she allowed herself to cry. That night, Iris found her packing the small wooden box of her father's journals into her trunk, not toward any destination, only toward the familiar comfort of preparing to disappear before someone could ask her to leave first. "Don't," Iris said simply, sitting on the edge of the bed. "He's not asking you to go. He's terrified, and he doesn't know how to be terrified out loud, so it comes out sounding like anger. I've watched him do it my whole life." Rena closed the trunk lid slowly. "I'm so tired of being the thing people are afraid of," she whispered. Iris took her hand, 16 years old and somehow wiser than the rest of the house combined. "Then stop being afraid of being seen," she said. "You're the only person who's ever made that horse trust someone again. Don't let one bad morning convince you that wasn't real." In the doorway, unnoticed until he spoke, stood Toby in his nightshirt, clutching a wooden horse Corwin had carved for him that summer. "Are you leaving?" he asked, and his small voice cracked with a fear far too old for a 6-year-old to be carrying. Rena crossed the room and knelt in front of him before she had even decided to. "No," she said, and found, saying it aloud to him, that she meant it more certainly than she had managed to mean anything in weeks. "I'm not leaving you, Toby. Not tonight. Not tomorrow." He studied her face with the unblinking seriousness only small children can manage, then nodded once, satisfied, and held out the wooden horse for her to keep. A gift offered with the same fierce, uncomplicated loyalty he had shown her since the day they met. Rena closed her fingers around the small carved shape and understood, finally, that leaving had stopped being a real option the moment this house had quietly, without her noticing, become full of people who needed her to stay. Roan did not sleep that night, or the night after. He sat in his late father's study long past midnight with Edmund's last letter spread open on the desk before him, a letter he had read perhaps 100 times in 2 years, and never once finished without folding it shut before the final line, the line where his brother had written that he forgave him, that brothers argued and brothers forgave, and he would see Roan in the morning to laugh about it over breakfast. There had been no morning. Roan had spent 2 years punishing a horse and himself in equal measure for a death that belonged, if it belonged to anyone, to a storm and a cliff path, and his own stubborn pride in sending his brother out into the dark with hard words instead of soft ones. He thought of Rena's voice in the wet morning grass. He thought of his own hands shaking, not with anger at her, but with the terror of watching someone he had, somewhere in the careful, unguarded months between them, quietly come to love stand in exactly the spot where he had buried his brother's memory like something dangerous. He traced his thumb along the worn fold lines of the letter, paper softened and grey at the creases from 2 years of handling, and for the first time he let himself read all the way to the final line without stopping. "I forgive you, you stubborn fool, and I expect a full apology over eggs tomorrow, with extra butter, since you owe me that much at least." He laughed, a short broken sound with no humour left in it, and then he put his face in his hands and wept the way he had refused to weep at the funeral, refused to weep in front of his mother, refused to weep even alone in this very room for 2 entire years, because grief, he had decided long ago, was a door that once opened might never close again. Sitting there in the dark with his brother's forgiveness finally read in full, he began slowly to suspect that he had been wrong about that for a very long time. It was the Dowager Duchess who found him there at dawn, and Augusta Ashgrove, who had spent 2 years grieving her younger son in silence because grief in that family had always been a private, locked affair, sat across from him and said something she had never said aloud before. "I have watched you build a fortress around every soft thing in this house since Edmund died," she said. "I let you, because I built my own fortress just the same way. But that girl has been quietly knocking on every locked door in this family for 6 months, and not one of us has had the courage to open one for her." She paused, her composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "Delphine Crane came to me with poison dressed as concern, and I drank it because it was easier than admitting I was wrong about her from the very first day she arrived in a borrowed dress with nothing left in the world but her father's old journals, and more dignity than this entire family has shown her combined." Roan found Rena in the morning room an hour later, and for the first time in their entire marriage, he did not arrive with careful distance or practiced courtesy. He arrived with his collar open and his hands unsteady, and an apology he had clearly been rehearsing and abandoning all night. "I was not angry at you," he said without preamble. "I have never once been angry at you. I was angry at a cliff path and a storm and my own mouth for the last words I ever said to my brother, and you happened to be standing close enough to catch all of it." Rena set down her teacup very carefully, afraid that if her hands trembled, he might mistake it for fear of him rather than fear of hoping. "Tell me about him," she said softly. "Not what Corwin told me. Tell me what you remember." So he did. He told her about Edmund teaching him to swim in the lake behind the house when Roan was 7 and terrified of deep water, about Edmund's laugh that could fill a room twice its size, about the argument that had started over something so small neither of them could now remember the original cause, only the terrible weight of the words that had grown out of it. He told her about standing at the edge of Cray's Gorge 2 days later, watching them carry his brother's body up the path, and deciding in that single unbearable moment that he would never again let himself care about anything enough for its loss to do that to him a second time. "And then you arrived," he said quietly, "in a borrowed dress, asking nothing of me, and somehow I have spent 6 months caring anyway, against every instruction I gave myself." Rena reached across the small distance between them and took his hand, and he let her, which from a man who had spent 2 years refusing to let anyone close enough to touch his grief was its own kind of confession. "I'm not leaving Thrain," she said gently when the silence had stretched long enough to need filling. "And I'm not leaving you either, unless you ask me to, in which case I should warn you, I will probably argue." Something that had not visited Roan Ashgrove's face in 2 years finally arrived there, unsteady and unfamiliar and entirely real. "Don't leave either of them," he said. "Teach me, instead. I don't know how to be near that horse without remembering exactly what I lost. Show me what you've been doing at dawn for 2 months that I was too proud to ask about." It was not a grand declaration. It was a man finally choosing the door he had kept locked for 2 years, and Rena understood, watching him say it, that this quiet unlocking mattered far more than any words of love he might eventually find the courage to say aloud. They walked to the paddock together that very afternoon, the first time Roan had crossed that fence line in 2 years, and he stood frozen at the gate for a long moment before Rena simply took his hand and led him through it, the way she had once led a frightened cart horse to safety with nothing more than a steady grip and a calm voice. Thrain lifted his head and watched the Duke approach with old, wary eyes, ears flicking back once before settling forward again, some ancient memory stirring at the sight of a face that shared his lost rider's blood. Roan did not reach for him. He simply stood at Rena's shoulder, breathing hard, watching his brother's horse watch him in return, and when Thrain finally lowered his great scarred head and exhaled a long, shuddering breath into the summer air, something in Roan's chest unclenched for the first time in 2 years, slow and painful and entirely necessary, like a bone resetting after being broken too long to heal straight. News of a reconciled Duke and Duchess walking together to the East Paddock spread through Larkspur Hall faster than any scandal ever had, and within a fortnight it reached Lady Delphine Crane in the worst possible way, second-hand and humiliating, confirming that every careful seed of doubt she had planted had failed to take root. The annual Larkspur Spring Contest was approaching, the oldest tradition on the estate, where county families gathered to watch the household's finest horsemanship displayed before the season's society calendar truly began, and word had quietly travelled that the Duchess intended to ride Thrain in the opening exhibition as a tribute to the late Captain Edmund Ashgrove. Delphine heard it at a card party in the village and felt something cold and furious settle behind her ribs. She had wanted Larkspur for herself for 3 years. She was not prepared to watch a blacksmith's daughter turn the family's deepest wound into a public triumph that would make her beloved by the very society Delphine had spent a lifetime cultivating. She returned home that night and sat alone at her writing desk for a long while, staring at nothing, turning over every possible way to undo what she could feel slipping permanently out of her reach. She had told herself for 3 years that Roan's marriage to a stranger was a temporary inconvenience, a debt repaid that would eventually fade into a quiet, loveless arrangement she might still find a way to outlast. The story of the Duchess and the Warhorse had ended that fantasy more thoroughly than any rejection ever could have, and Delphine, who had built her entire sense of worth on being chosen, found she would rather burn the whole thing down than watch it bloom in front of a county that had once, briefly, considered her the obvious future Duchess of Larkspur. By morning, her fury had organized itself into a plan small enough to seem deniable and cruel enough to feel, to her, like justice. What she did next, she told herself afterward, was meant only to frighten, not to harm, though that distinction mattered very little to the people standing in the path of its consequences. 2 nights before the contest, she bribed a stable hand newly hired and easily tempted, a young man who did not know enough about Larkspur's history to understand the weight of what he was being paid to do. He was told only to weaken a single girth strap, just enough to fray under pressure rather than snap outright. A small private humiliation meant to send the proud new Duchess tumbling gracelessly into the dirt in front of every family that mattered in the county. Delphine imagined Rena's mortification, imagined the whispers afterward, imagined Roan quietly reconsidering a marriage built on convenience once his wife had been thoroughly, publicly embarrassed. She did not imagine a 6-year-old boy chasing a runaway puppy directly into the contest field at the exact moment everything went wrong. The stable hand's hands had shaken the entire time he worked the small blade along the leather's underside, hidden behind the tack room door in the dead of night, and twice he nearly abandoned the task entirely before the memory of the coins already spent on his sister's medicine pushed him back to finish it. He told himself, the way frightened people often do, that nothing truly terrible could come of so small an act, that a frayed strap was a far cry from a deliberate weapon, that the Duchess was an experienced rider who would likely never even fall hard enough to be hurt. He did not know about Toby. He did not know about the puppy. He only knew, walking away from the stable that night with Delphine's coins heavy in his pocket, that he felt sick in a way money had never quite managed to cure before. Corwin noticed something amiss the morning of the contest, a faint unevenness in the stitching along Thrain's girth that made him frown and run his thumb along the leather twice. But the yard was chaos that day, carriages arriving, grooms shouting, the Dowager Duchess issuing instructions about seating arrangements that contradicted themselves every 10 minutes, and he set the saddle aside, meaning to inspect it properly before deciding it could wait until after the morning's opening events. It was a small, human, forgivable mistake, the kind made in every busy stable yard in England every single day, and it would very nearly cost everything. Rena spent the morning calm in a way that surprised even herself, dressing in a riding habit Iris had insisted on having made specially, deep green wool with a single silver button at the throat, simple enough to honor a soldier rather than perform for a crowd. Roan found her before she walked to the paddock and pressed his forehead briefly to hers. No words necessary between them anymore for the things that mattered most. Iris had sewn the silver button herself the night before, refusing all offers of help from the household seamstress, insisting it had to be done by someone who loved Rena rather than someone who was simply paid to dress her. Edmund had a button just like it on his old riding coat, she admitted quietly, threading the needle by candlelight. I thought he'd like knowing some small piece of him was riding out there with you today. Rena had not trusted her own voice to answer that, only reached over and squeezed the girl's hand, grateful beyond words for a family that had, in the space of a single difficult year, become entirely and unexpectedly her own. Toby, refusing to be left behind, had insisted on carrying her riding crop to the paddock himself, marching ahead of her with the solemn importance of a boy entrusted with the single most critical task of the entire morning, utterly unaware of how close that ordinary errand was about to bring him to disaster. The field that morning was the largest the contest had drawn in a decade, word of the Duchess's tribute having travelled through every parlour in the county, and Rena felt the weight of every gathered eye as she walked toward the paddock, where Thrain waited, already saddled, already calm beneath Corwin's steady hand. She did not yet know about the strap. Toby did not know he was meant to stay seated quietly beside his nursemaid at the edge of the crowd, distracted entirely by the small white puppy belonging to a neighbouring family that had slipped its lead and gone tearing happily across the open field toward the very ropes marking the contest course. The Dowager Duchess, seated in the place of honor for the first time beside Roan rather than apart from him, watched her daughter-in-law approach the gate with something that had finally, completely, become pride rather than doubt. Lady Delphine Crane watched from the third row of seating, smiling, certain and entirely unaware that the small cruelty she had purchased 2 nights before was about to collide with a frightened child in a way no one, including her, had ever intended or could now stop. Rena lifted the latch, stepped into the paddock and laid her palm against Thrain's scarred neck exactly as she had every dawn for 2 months. The horse leaned into her touch, calm, trusting, ready. Somewhere behind them, a small white puppy darted under the rope line, and a 6-year-old boy in a sailor suit, laughing and oblivious to every careful plan unraveling around him, ran after it directly into the open field, straight toward the path the warhorse was meant to walk in a moment everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. The crowd's gasp arrived a full second before anyone understood why, a ripple of motion catching every eye toward the small figure sprinting across open ground after a runaway puppy, directly into the space where 2,000 pounds of trained warhorse stood between the gate and the contest course. Toby did not see the danger. He saw only the small white dog skidding to a stop 10 feet from Thrain's hooves, and he ran straight for it without a single thought for anything else in the world. The puppy yapped sharply, startled by its own momentum, and the sharp, unfamiliar sound combined with the sudden small shape darting too close was exactly the kind of chaos Thrain's war-scarred instincts had been trained years before to answer with violence rather than calm. He reared, hooves cutting the air exactly as the weakened girth strap chose that precise instant of strain to finally, audibly snap. The saddle slid sideways, throwing Rena's balance and very nearly her seat entirely, but she had not yet mounted, had only been standing at his shoulder, and in the half-second the world offered her, she made the only choice available to anyone who had ever loved something enough to risk everything for it. She did not step back. She lunged forward instead, straight toward the rearing horse and the screaming child both, and seized the loose rein hanging free from his throat with both hands, just as Roan's voice tore across the field behind her, raw with a terror 2 years and one painful unlocking deep. The same 5 words that had haunted the opening of this entire story finally arriving in their full, devastating context. You cannot control that warhorse. It was not an order this time. It was a man watching the 2 people he loved most in the world stand directly beneath 2,000 pounds of falling hooves, and finding he had no other words left inside him at all. The Dowager Duchess rose fully to her feet, one hand pressed to her mouth, and beside her, Lady Iris had already torn past 2 rows of seated guests toward the rope line before Corwin's arm caught her around the waist and held her back. The puppy, having caused the entire disaster without ever understanding it had done anything wrong, yapped and circled Toby's frozen ankles, oblivious to the falling hooves directly above his small head. Every wealthy, important, carefully dressed person on that field discovered in the same suspended heartbeat that none of their titles or their gossip or their carefully cultivated opinions about a breeder's daughter meant anything at all in the face of a child about to be crushed beneath a panicking warhorse. And for the first time in the entire history of the Larkspur Spring Contest, 300 people watched in absolute helpless silence rather than polite performative interest. Rena did not let go. Thrain's front hooves came down a hand's width from Toby's small frozen shoulder, close enough that the boy felt the wind of it lift his hair, and the horse screamed again, rearing a second time, every trained instinct in his body fighting the unfamiliar weakness of a saddle sliding loose across his back. I know, Rena said, voice steady despite everything, the same low, certain tone she had used every single dawn for 2 months. I know what they took from you. I know exactly what this feels like. She held the rein with both hands and stepped directly under his lowering head, between the horse and the child, offering her own body as the only barrier between 2,000 pounds of panic and a 6-year-old boy too frightened to move. For one impossible, suspended second, the entire field held its breath together, certain it was about to witness a tragedy no contest trophy could ever justify having risked. Thrain's front hooves touched the earth and stayed there. His great chest heaved, sides slick with sweat, eyes still wide and white-rimmed, but his head came down slowly into the small space Rena had made for him, his nose pressing hard against her shoulder exactly as it had every morning for 2 months when the only audience had been the dawn fog and a stablemaster too moved to speak of it. Corwin was already running, scooping Toby up from beneath the horse's lowered head before the boy's sobbing could startle the animal again, carrying him safely backward toward his frantic nursemaid, while 300 people remained frozen in absolute silence, watching the Duchess of Larkspur stand calmly beside a warhorse. No soldier, groom, or duke had ever fully tamed, her hand resting against his trembling neck as though she had done it 1,000 times before, because in the quiet hours no one else had witnessed, she had. Roan reached the paddock fence with his chest heaving, half climbing, half falling over the rail in his desperation to reach her, and stopped short the moment he saw she was unharmed. The boy was safe, and the horse, impossibly, miraculously, stood quiet beneath her hand. The master of the contest, an elderly baron who had judged this event for 30 years and never once seen anything resembling what had just happened on his field, rose slowly from his seat with his ceremonial ribbons still clutched forgotten in one hand. "In 30 years," he announced, his voice carrying across the silenced crowd, "I have never witnessed greater mastery of a horse, nor greater courage in a rider. The spring contest is awarded, without contest, to Her Grace, the Duchess of Larkspur." The crowd's silence broke into something between a gasp and a cheer, uncertain which emotion to choose first, and somewhere in the third row, Lady Delphine Crane sat frozen white-faced beside the very stable hand whose nervous, guilty glance toward the broken girth strap had not gone unnoticed by Corwin, who was already crossing the field with the snapped leather held out like evidence in his closed fist. Roan climbed fully into the paddock then, ignoring every rule of decorum that had governed his entire life, and gathered both his wife and the trembling child into his arms at once, his whole body shaking with the aftershock of fear finally allowed to release. "You scared me," he said into Rena's hair, voice cracking entirely now. No careful, dukish composure left to hide behind in front of 300 witnesses. "You scared me more than anything has scared me since the night Edmund rode out in that storm." Rena held him and Toby both. Thrain's great head still pressed against her shoulder, and felt the strange, overwhelming relief of an entire life's worth of fear finally exhaling out of her chest at once. "I'm here," she said simply, to both of them, to all of them, to the whole watching field if they cared to listen. "I'm not going anywhere." The truth came apart quickly once Corwin laid the cut girth strap across the judging table for every gathered family to see. The clean, deliberate slice along its underside, impossible to mistake for ordinary wear, no matter how desperately Delphine tried to argue otherwise. The young stable hand, white with fear and unwilling to carry the full weight of a near tragedy alone, confessed everything within the hour, naming the lady who had paid him and the instructions she had given, careful enough she believed to avoid real harm, careless enough in truth to have nearly cost a child his life. There was no trial, no magistrate summoned from London, no lawyers drawing up grievances on heavy paper. Larkspur had never needed that kind of justice, and Roan, standing with his arm around his wife in front of the entire gathered county, chose instead the older, sharper punishment available to families like his. He simply told the assembled guests, in a voice that carried to every corner of the field, that Lady Delphine Crane would no longer be welcome at Larkspur Hall, nor at any event hosted by the Ashgrove family, for as long as he held the title. By evening, every house in the county had quietly closed its doors to her in turn, because reputation, among people who valued nothing else quite so highly, was its own swift and absolute verdict. Delphine left the field that day alone, her carriage rattling down the long drive, while every family she had once dined with watched her go without a single word of farewell. And whatever satisfaction Rena might once have imagined feeling at that sight never arrived at all. There was only a quiet, tired sorrow for a woman who had spent her whole life believing that being chosen by someone important was the only proof of her own worth, and had been willing to risk a child's safety rather than accept that the choosing had simply, finally, gone another way. Rena did not watch the carriage disappear. She had a small boy clinging to her skirts, and a husband who would not let go of her hand, and there was nothing left in that moment worth turning away from either of them to witness. Toby was found that night, not in his own small bed, but curled against Rena's side in the drawing room, having refused to sleep anywhere else until she promised, 3 separate times, that the big black horse was truly, completely fine. Iris sat across from them both with the white puppy, rescued from its terrified hiding place behind the stable wall, now sleeping contentedly in her lap, as though it had not caused the entire near catastrophe single-handedly. The Dowager Duchess entered the room quietly, something soft and entirely unguarded in her face for the first time since Rena had arrived at Larkspur 8 months before, and sat beside her without a word, simply reaching over to take Rena's hand in both of her own, an apology offered in the only language that family had ever truly trusted. "I was wrong about you from the very first afternoon," Augusta said finally, quietly. "I'm sorry it took my grandson nearly being trampled for me to admit it properly." Rena squeezed her hand and said nothing at all, because some forgivenesses did not need extra words layered on top of them to be complete. Roan found her later that night exactly where he expected to, standing at the east paddock fence beneath a sky finally clear of clouds. Thrain standing calm and close beside her in the moonlight, his scarred coat silvered, his ears relaxed forward for what Corwin swore was the very first time in 2 full years. Roan came to stand beside her without speaking at first, simply resting his forearms on the same fence rail, watching the horse that had carried his brother through a war and brought him home from it changed in ways none of them had understood how to forgive. "I used to come here at night sometimes," he admitted finally, "just to stand on the other side of this fence and not be able to bring myself to open the gate. I told myself it was about the horse. I think now it was always about the conversation I never finished having with Edmund." Rena leaned her shoulder against his arm. "Then finish it," she said gently. "He's right here. He's been waiting 2 years for someone in this family to walk through that gate." Roan was quiet for a long moment, and then for the first time in 2 years, he lifted the latch himself and stepped into the paddock that had been Edmund's smallest surviving piece of the world. Thrain's head came up sharply at the sound, ears flicking, the old wariness flashing briefly across his dark eyes. And then, recognizing perhaps the voice that had once shouted across this very field in fear rather than anger, he simply lowered his head and let the Duke of Larkspur rest a trembling hand against his neck for the first time since the night his brother rode away in a storm and never came home. Roan pressed his forehead to the horse's shoulder and said something too quiet for Rena to hear, words that had clearly been waiting 2 long years for exactly this moment to finally be spoken. And when he straightened again, his eyes were wet and entirely unashamed of it, and something in his whole frame had loosened, the way a fist finally opens after holding too tightly for too long. They walked back to the house together beneath a sky scattered with stars, Rena's hand folded inside his, and at the garden door he stopped her gently and turned to face her fully, no careful distance left anywhere between them at all. "I didn't marry you out of love," he said quietly. "I want you to know that I am fully, completely aware of that fact, and I want you to also know that it is the single greatest regret of my entire life, because I have come to love you more thoroughly than I ever believed myself capable of loving anything again, and I very nearly lost you to a horse and a stranger's cruelty before I found the courage to say so." Rena felt something in her chest she had not allowed herself to feel since her father's death. Warm and certain, and entirely without fear of being taken away again. "Then say it properly," she whispered. "I love you, Rena Ashgrove," Roan said, and meant it with his whole unguarded heart. Behind them, in the moonlit paddock, a warhorse finally healed of 2 years' grief, lowered his great scarred head, and slept peacefully for the very first time since the war had ended and brought him home. A year later, on a bright morning when the Yorkshire moors had finally shaken off the last of winter, a small crowd gathered again at the same fence where everything had once nearly fallen apart. Though this time there was no contest, no judging table, no whisper of scandal in the air at all. Toby, taller now and considerably braver, sat astride Thrain's broad back with Rena walking calmly alongside, one hand resting on the horse's shoulder out of habit rather than necessity, while Iris sketched the whole scene in a notebook she had taken to carrying everywhere. The Dowager Duchess watched from a garden chair with a shawl Rena herself had knitted across her knees, and Roan stood at the fence rail exactly where he had once stood, frozen in fear, watching now instead with the steady, unguarded contentment of a man who had finally, fully, opened every locked door in his own house. Larkspur Hall no longer felt like a museum to anyone who lived there. It felt at last entirely and unmistakably like home, and the warhorse no one had once been able to control grazed peacefully in the spring sunlight, healed by patience, by love, and by a woman the whole county had once underestimated and would never, ever underestimate again. The end.